afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division here at the Rochester Public Library. And welcome to Lost and Found, the photos of Henry Durgin, Rochester's most talented amateur photographer of the 1880s and 1890s. Henry Durgin's journey from a Civil War veteran to Rochester's most talented amateur photographer epitomizes the spirit of industrial innovation and artistic discovery in late 19th century Western New York. With a keen eye and a dedication to capturing the essence of the region and its cultural landscape, Durgin produced a collection of over 150 photographs, providing a unique glimpse of Rochester's past. Lost for decades, Durgin's photographic collection was rediscovered in the 1990s and is now a treasured part of the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York. Our presenter today is Cynthia Howk. Cynthia Howk is a native of Rochester and was on the staff of the Landmark Society of Western New York as Architectural Research Coordinator for 45 years. She has lectured extensively on local and regional history, architecture, and historic preservation. Ladies and gentlemen, Cynthia Howk.
Now, could you all hear me through the microphone? We can't touch the microphone. It's very sensitive. We have to use the podium going up and down. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming in from the heat and humidity on a June afternoon on a Saturday. This is a very interesting program whose genesis goes way back to the 1990s and started through a very simple phone call from my colleague, the late Carl Kabelak, who was archivist in the special collections at Rush Rees Library at the University of Rochester. And he said, "Cynthia, what can you tell me about Henry Durgin?" I said, "I've never heard of him." Well, he had had a phone call from a colleague over in Cooperstown at a museum that was then called the New York State Historical Association, but is now the Fenimore Art Museum, a beautiful 1920s mansion built by the wealthy Clark family based in Cooperstown. The colleague at the Cooperstown Museum was writing an essay for their quarterly journal on Henry Durgin, known as the most talented amateur photographer in Rochester in the late 19th century. Carl and I, both serious nerds about local history, had never heard of him. Fortunately, in 1912, when he died, there was an extensive article in the Democrat and Chronicle newspaper that told about this remarkable individual, a native of Laconia, New Hampshire. What you see on the screen is one of these images that's at the Fenimore Museum in Cooperstown. We will get into later how they got to Cooperstown, but they are over 130 5x7 prints that are glued onto a dark brown, sort of a cardboard backing. And fortunately, Henry was a very organized gentleman. He wrote the identification of every site on each photograph, or we would have been in an absolute mystery as to most of what we were looking at, frankly, because they were scenes either so changed today or scenes, frankly, never photographed in the 19th century, including one site in my own North Winton Road neighborhood, of which I had never seen photos from earlier decades. This is the article that Milo Stewart wrote in that journal in about 1992 from Cooperstown. Elegant images, Genesee Valley views. There were about 10 of Durgin's photos featured in this article, and when Carl Kabelak and I did see this journal, we were absolutely bowled over and thrilled to see what was in this collection, because it had certainly not been digitized. That just happened recently, and there was no master list that they could then send us from Cooperstown. This is Henry Durgin, photographed in his later years. He was born in 1841 in New Hampshire, a family of 3 boys, 1 girl, mom and dad. The family was involved in the whaling industry. They were near the Atlantic seaboard. But sadly, in the 1850s, the first of several tragedies occurred to the family. There was a vote, there was to be a local election at the Laconia Town Hall, and all of the gentlemen, women did not vote at that time, all of the men in town eligible to vote went to vote, and it was up on the second floor of the town hall, whose contractor was not as talented as he thought he might, because there were so many people that far exceeded the weight capacity. The entire floor collapsed down into the basement, and a number of people died, one of whom was Henry's father. So that leaves a wife and 4 children. We don't know a lot about his early life until we do know about his brother Charles becomes into the whaling industry as well as a woodworker. We're going to talk about him later. The first we get documents that survive about Henry is he enlists in the 8th Regiment Infantry in the Civil War. He becomes their head bugler, but he's also in charge of their ambulance. That means you go out on the battlefield with colleagues and you are rescuing people on stretchers and bringing them back. And there's some letters that you can access online from his mother that talk about some of his experiences during the war. He becomes a POW, and we're going to talk about that later. As I mentioned, the family gets involved with the whaling industry, so that means they certainly start to travel far beyond the shores of New Hampshire's seacoast. And the type of ship that you would have often been on a whaler, here is the last surviving wooden whaling vessel from the 19th century, the magnificent Charles W. Morgan, under sail 10 years ago, a rare experience. It is now berthed in the Mystic Seaport, Connecticut Museum, that if you've never been to, is one of the great treats of any kind of museum, whether you're a maritime history fan or not. This is the 1912 article that appeared in the Democrat and Chronicle here in Rochester that talks about Henry Durgin. He was quite an interesting person, and there are major gaps still in his life that we don't quite know about. For example, even though he came to Rochester in 1868, and he was in the Civil War until 1864, we really don't know how he came to Rochester. In this article, it said he came here from Chattanooga, Tennessee. He had no relations in Rochester, so that's still a mystery as to how he came here. He became very active. He was a successful businessman. He was active in local politics. He was served in the Masonic Order. He was an elected trustee of the Chamber of Commerce. His business background, because remember, we're talking about an amateur photographer. That was not his that was not his way of earning a living. And he apparently became very successful. In his obituary, he was described as one of the best mechanics in New York State and an extremely talented draftsman, which certainly comes into play when he has his furniture company, and he does get a patent for a brace that is still used today when you are building a table at the corner to give extra strength. You can go online and see the drawings of this brace that Mr. Durgin had. He formed several companies for furniture making when he was in Rochester, the last of which was named Copeland and Durgin. He had been a superintendent of the company under its previous name, and his 2 brothers were involved with the business. Charles, who decided not to went out of whaling and became a carpenter. He was here for about 3 years. And his brother James Durgin, who became superintendent and secretary of the company until his untimely death by suicide in 1901. And he is buried in Rochester, where Charles and Henry are not. Now, some context of photography here in Rochester during the last quarter of the 19th century. While Henry Durgin was considered an amateur photographer because he did not get paid for photography that he took, and we don't know what inspired him and what images he took other than the ones that have survived. We have no other records that have come forward. In the realm of professional photographers in Rochester, New York, we had John H. Kent, and this is the back of one of his cards that he produced. He became president of a National Photographers Association, and he is known for having taken more photographs of Frederick Douglass than any other photographer. John Kent, when he was younger, gave a young businessman a loan to help him get going in the business, and that proved very successful because that young businessman was George Eastman. And when Eastman incorporated the Eastman Kodak Company in the 1890s, John Kent became vice president. And his exceptionally beautiful family mausoleum in the Egyptian revival style is something everyone should see in Riverside Cemetery. Now, to give you an example of one of Mr. Kent's photographs, we have this photograph of Miss Ella Leland from October of 1870. She's beautiful. This is just a gorgeous photograph. Kent's name is in the lower left-hand corner, but there's tragedy associated with this photograph and where I got it. This photograph is in the photo album of Dr. Charles Forbes, who trained as a doctor but became a polymath. He was at a professional level in photography, invention, and educational circles. Sadly, Miss Leland and friends from her school group went on a picnic down on Arundecoit Bay in July of 1871, and she and them, it was an overloaded boat. Those ladies had hoop skirts, pounds and pounds of fabric. The boat capsized, and sadly, everyone drowned. It's all in the newspaper. But here, because she had been a student in Dr. Forbes' classes at the Rochester Free Academy, he wanted a picture of her to put in his newly formed album. Now, here is that album. It was a gift to him on his birthday from his mother, and Dr. Forbes, even though his principal professional occupation was as an instructor at the Rochester Free Academy, our first high school, he also was on the faculties of Macalester College in Minneapolis when it opened, Elmira College, and Columbia University at 2 different times. So he was very well known in a lot of circles, and he was an inventor as well. His photo album and hundreds of his glass plate negatives were passed down through the family to modern times. And in the 1980s, his granddaughter gifted his glass plate negatives to the George Eastman Museum. I've been fortunate to work with that woman's son, a retired architect in Pulteneyville, because his mom had not found all the glass plate negatives. There's another cache of 100 glass plate negatives out in Pulteneyville of Dr. Forbes, and we're going to see some of his views at the end. And they are also going to the Eastman House. But he was an amateur, but the photography he did was really at a professional level. This is one of Dr. Forbes' photographs. Can you see these images? They're not as dark as they could be. Brandon, can we cut all the lights? Because I'm not sure how this is showing up on streaming. There we go. You don't need to see me. This is one of Dr. Forbes' photographs, and this is where circumstances sometimes are beyond reality. I had a phone call from Chip Stevens about 4 years ago, who had all of these Dr. Forbes images, and he asked me, "Do you know a Lois Howk?" I said, "Yes, she's my great aunt. She married my grandfather's brother." "I've got a picture of her." "Really? Why?" Well, the ladies that you see in this beautifully posed circa 1910 photograph with that gigantic Japanese parasol in the background. This is a Dr. Forbes photo. On the right is Dr. Forbes' daughter, Mary Elizabeth Forbes, who would become a stage and screen actress. Her last movie was The 10 Commandments in 1956. She was friends with Cecil B. DeMille, the director. In the front is Ruth Crippen, Mary Elizabeth's third cousin, Vassar College, class of 1904. And on the left is my great aunt, then known as Mary Lois Hollister. These ladies were all born in the late 1870s, early 80s. Lois is Smith College, class of 1905. She and Ruth, were best friends from the 1880s until their deaths far beyond their 80th birthday. So all of these ladies were photographed in the backyard of the Forbes home in Rochester by Dr. Forbes, these beautiful early 20th century summer dresses. Even if that wasn't my great aunt, I love this photograph. It's so lovely to look at. And each of these ladies have tremendous individual stories that we can't go into today. Another photographer in town that was a professional was John W. Taylor. He worked from the 1870s till the early 20th century. His studios were on East Main Street, and then they were on South Clinton Avenue near Washington Square. This is a rather unusual photograph because he did most of his work in studio. This is an outdoor photograph, but a truly remarkable document for who's in it and what you're looking at. You are looking at 27 Madison Street in the Susan B. Anthony neighborhood, just 3 doors north of Susan's house. In front of this is on a double lot. It's the biggest house in the neighborhood. It still looks just like this today, and it's still on a double lot. Standing in front of the house is John Taylor's sister, Jane, who's married to Mr. Coleman, a businessman that you see on the left, and their 2 daughters, Augusta and Lillian. This house would be in the the Coleman family till 1957, a full 100 years. This is a rare view of a house, not Susan B. Anthony's, but to give you a sense of when this was taken. It was taken in the 1890s from the age of, or the 1880s by the age of the children. And it shows the neighborhood when Susan B. Anthony lived in that neighborhood. There are not many photos of the Madison Square neighborhood in Susan's time. So you can see things like mounting blocks, hitching posts, stone sidewalks, the type of landscaping. And Susan B. Anthony knew the Coleman family very well. In fact, because Susan's house was so small, she'd often have meetings here in the Coleman parlors, which were much, much larger. On the back of this photo is handwritten when the photo was taken, when the house was built, 1857, at a cost of $3,000, and the names of everyone who was in the photograph. This is what we all dream about when we find photos. This remained in the Coleman descendants, and it's now been donated to a local archive. So let's get to the topic, Henry Durgin and his photographs. Here is one of them. This is Henry at 232 J Street, which still exists today. It has a commercial building wrapped around it. It's just off of West Broad Street. This is the house he lived in probably from the time he married in 1871 to a widow with 4 children. He never had any children of his own. And this would be his residence until the day literally he died at home in 1912 of a hemorrhage. It's a really interesting photo for many reasons. It shows us Henry, but it also shows us a more everyday neighborhood. This today is called Dutchtown, or it should be called Deutschtown, because it had a very heavy German population at the time that Henry Durgin and his family lived there. For those of us that like architecture, we just drool over photos like this because it shows us the original design and materials of the house. No vinyl siding, no replacement windows, no ugly additions. We can see what a everyday house like this would have been. Hundreds of these would have been all over Rochester, New York in this time period. Now, I mentioned that Henry Durgin had enlisted in the Civil War with the New Hampshire Regiment, and he was captured in 1854 at the Battle of Sabin's Corners in Louisiana and hauled off to this godforsaken place, Camp Ford, the largest federal internment camp west of the Mississippi. This is in Texas, and this is an artist's illustration of the conditions that were barbaric, to say the least. Now, how can I know that? I can look at this photograph, but I can also read Henry Durgin's diary that he kept while he was a POW, and it makes for immensely interesting reading. It is digitized, it is online, and today it's in the Pierce Museum at Navarro College in Texas, and it is a major part of Texas curriculum for Civil War history. So do go look at Henry's Civil War diary if you want a first-person account of some of the conditions the Union POWs experienced, in this case, a Texas POW camp. He was traded, there was a prisoner exchange, that's how he got out of Camp Ford, and then came to Rochester by 1868 with his brothers, James and Charles, and eventually this is a photo he took of the most successful part of his business, Copeland and Durgin, furniture manufacturers. You are looking at a scene everything in this photo has vanished from existence. In the foreground is the Erie Canal. The photographer is standing on the J Street Bridge that went over the canal. There's no canal in Rochester anymore. It was drained by 1920. On the south shore is the factory campus of Copeland and Durgin. And you can see the factory here. And I'm not showing you all of his photos today. This is just a sampling. They have been digitized, and hopefully they will be available online soon. Here is the back side of the Copeland and Durgin factory, showing the office where not only Henry would have been working as president of the company, but his brother James, who was secretary and the superintendent of the works until his untimely death in 1901. He had had serious health problems and sadly went home one day with a serious headache. This is all in the newspaper. And there was chloroform at home. He put it on a handkerchief. His wife had to leave the house briefly, and when she came home, he had died. He had put the chloroform over his face, and he had died of the effects. I think that 1901 death of his brother had a lot to do with Henry Durgin's career, because in 1901, Henry Durgin left this company, which he owned, and he went to work for the Brownell division of Eastman Kodak Company, where he would remain for the rest of his working life. That is in that 1912 obituary. Now, the era in which Henry is taking these photos, we do not know when he got interested in photography. We don't know when he started to take photos, how he made selections, because they're not all in Rochester. They are in out of county as well. And he made a trip to Bermuda, and there are images from the Bermuda trip. But he took a wide range of photographs. Here is somebody from a coal and lumber company sitting on he's delivering product, and there's a horse. This is not somebody from Copeland and Durgin, but it's a picture of an everyday Rochester citizen who has a blue-collar job, and Henry had decided to capture that as an image. This is a scene that is not identified with a caption, and all of us that know local history have scratched our heads for many months looking at this. We're not quite sure where this scene is. We don't think it's in the city of Rochester because the two houses shown on the banks of the canal are not closely spaced together like you would have seen in Rochester, New York. Not far from Henry's factory on the west side of the city on J Street is, of course, Rochester's oldest industrial area, the High Falls area. And he took many images of this particular area. Now, for him to get the current image, he had to somehow get down the gorge to the bottom of the gorge, set up his equipment, which must have been heavy. I'm assuming there was a camera and a tripod involved. And he captured this fabulous image looking southwest. The Gores Line building on the right still exists, but the buildings on the left or the east side of the river, none of that exists today. We had a researcher at the Landmark Society who saw this and said, I wish I would have had this photo when I was doing my master's thesis, because I'd never seen pictures of the buildings on the east side of the river. Another angle, still dramatic and quite attractive aesthetically. Here are those buildings on the east side of the river at High Falls. High Falls is an interesting geological feature because while it's High Falls, at one point it was blasted and the city brought down its height 10 feet to its current height today. It had to do with flooding that would be periodically a problem downtown. Now, imagine carting all of this camera equipment around, and it's winter time. He is now down at the bottom of the gorge taking this picture where everything is encased in ice. I don't know how he did this. There was no easy access to the bottom of the gorge in the city. But he managed to do it, and he took this photograph as a winter setting again because the falls were so popular. Here's another photograph. This is as you're going north toward Lower Falls, which actually has two sets of waterfalls, the ones that you see from the Driving Park Bridge and then ones that are a little bit south of there. These are the falls that are a little bit south of the major 67-foot high Lower Falls, And you see he's framed this with some abandoned industrial equipment in the foreground. Now, Lower Falls today looks like it's in the middle of a wilderness gorge, unless you look very carefully on the west side and you start to see all kinds of foundations from the buildings you're seeing here. Lower Falls was heavily industrialized well into the 20th century. There were all kind of manufacturers down there using the water power, and here is one of the photographs that shows the west side of the river and all of those various industrial buildings that were at Lower Falls that you can, if you walk down the road that's on the west side of the river, just off of Driving Park, you can access this area today. He also photographed Lower Falls in the wintertime during ice, snow, and really cold conditions. And here's yet another photograph looking directly west. I'm assuming he's up on the east bank of the river looking directly west at all of these fascinating buildings, of which absolutely nothing survives today. So this is a very important document. Now, by the time he was taking photographs up at Lower Falls, it's possible the Driving Park Bridge would have been built, which was in the 1890s, but I'm not exactly sure. The view you see here is Kelsey's Landing, which was on the east side of the river, just north of Driving Park Avenue, and there's an access point. There are boats and a boat landing down there, and if you get out your magnifying glass, there's a little tiny shed or little tiny building that has a person's name on it, and it says you can get dinner and fishing tackle at this store. So this was one way you can see I'm not quite sure what that is, tramway that takes you from the top of the gorge down to the bottom, because again, you are in the gorge. Access is not easy. Directly across from this site, Kelsey's Landing, we have a much more reasonable way of accessing the gorge. This is the famous Glen House, of which was on the west side of the river, just below Maplewood Park. It was destroyed by fire around, I think, 1900. And you see a very curious building to the left. That is a steam elevator. Because if you wanted to go to the Glen House, which thousands of people did, you would take a streetcar north on Lake Avenue to Driving Park Avenue in Maplewood Park, and you would get off the streetcar. You would walk over to the edge of the gorge, and you can see there is a walkway that comes out to that tower, that shaft. You'd walk there, and you would get in the steam elevator that would take you down to the bottom of the shaft, where you then could walk over to the Glen House, which had not only refreshments, but that was the landing where most of the tour boats left. Now, tour boats, who's going on tours? Everybody in Rochester when it becomes summertime and you wanted to get out of the city. Women were wearing corsets and thick clothing and petticoats. Gentlemen, you were in starched shirts and wool. There was no casual wear as we know it today. So where did the majority of citizens of Rochester go to beat the heat? They would go somewhere near the shore. They would either take the trolley all the way up to the village of Shalott, or they would come here to the Glen House where you could get into a tour boat. The boat would go north, up the river, into Lake Ontario, and then east over to and entering Arundecoit Bay, the entrance of which was much larger than it is today. And in Arundecoit Bay, there were any number of hotels where you could go and have dinner, you could have lunch, you could have beer, you could have refreshments. On the west side of the bay was Glen Haven Amusement Park. That was a big day outing on a Sunday for many, many, many Rochester residents for decades, because again, Sunday was the one day the majority of working people in the city worked a 6-day week up into the 1920s. So Glen House, in this view of a very important piece of cultural history, all of which has vanished, this view that Henry Durgin took is very important. Now this next view is very puzzling. This is a view of the east side of the gorge looking north. And in the foreground, imposed upon this, we would say it had been tweaked today, or somebody had digitally altered it. In the foreground on the flats, it says Union Clothing Company, Maine, at the corner of Water Street. Possibly this company hired Durgin to take a picture, and they used it in their advertising, but it's a very confusing image when you look at it. This image is most interesting because it's an institution that remains intact today, and it has grown tremendously. You are looking from the west bank of the Genesee River, you're looking to the east bank and the rear of the campus of the Rochester School for the Deaf, which came to that site in the 1880s. The building in the background is still in existence. It's the main administration building up at the School for the Deaf. This is another view taken across the river at the School for the Deaf, and if you look way over to the left, you'll see that large administration building, which for anyone that knows a little bit about Rochester history is a very confusing building because its cornerstone predates the School of the Deaf's existence. When I first saw the building, I said, this is very odd. This is an 1870s building, but the School for the Deaf was downtown in the beginning. Well, that's one of the great political follies of Rochester, New York, this tall mansard roof building that's still the administration building at the School for the Deaf. Its original purpose, a home for truant children, basically children that were homeless and all over the city downtown. The city records will show that there were many meetings at City Hall, people coming in, what are you going to do about all these homeless children that are downtown? Some of them were Civil War orphans, others were poor, but they were out on the street, they were begging, they were a very large population, and there were no social services unless you had something provided by a Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish orphanage. So the city fathers hired Andrew Jackson Warner, one of the well-known architects, and they put up money to build this building way up on St. Paul Street so they wouldn't be really near any neighborhood, and they opened it as the House for Truant Children. It was a colossal failure, and then it's documented in the newspapers. They didn't have enough money, they didn't have enough staffing, they didn't have enough training. Nothing worked. And finally, the city said, we're not wasting any more money on this. We're closing the House for Truant Children. They can go find some other place to live. It's not our responsibility to provide homes for them. And that's when the Rochester School for the Deaf purchased this campus. Take a look the next time you're up on St. Paul Street heading to the Seneca Park. Now, as I said, Henry Durgin also took photos that were not in the city of Rochester. On the left, that is, the caption says, a row of poplar trees in Shalott. Shalott at this time was an independent village. It did not become part of the city until the early 20th century. And when you got to about Ridge Road, Lake Avenue was then called Shalott Boulevard. So that just like if you went on the other side, St. Paul was called Somerville Boulevard in the early years. So here is a view that he wanted to capture of Shalott. Poplars on Shalott Boulevard. He also went over to Mount Hope Cemetery and took a number of images of very important statuary in the cemetery, such as this monument that looks very much like the Albert Memorial in front of Royal Albert Hall in London. He took a picture of the Ellwanger family's monument, Ellwanger and Berry Nursery Company, and the statue atop the Ellwanger monument was done by a very famous sculptor in Italy. He also took a very interesting historic image, particularly for those who are familiar with Mount Hope Cemetery today. We could not take this image. He is looking north toward the gatehouse, and just behind that last row of obelisks and monuments is a very large area of open lawn, where today there are 6 mausoleums that were built some years later. So this is a very interesting document of this view of the cemetery that's changed dramatically in the last 100 years. I'm assuming Henry Durgin rented horse and buggies to get a lot of these views, because now we're going to go to the town of Brighton and see a couple of views. Here's one in the Highland Avenue area, and we all know Highland Avenue does not look like this anymore. He also captured this view that he labeled Highland Avenue, a rural dirt roadway. You can see a fence for a pasture on the left, and an arch of lovely trees. Again, we don't know exactly where on Highland Avenue this is, but it is a far cry from anything we would see in the 20th century. This is not Mount Hope Cemetery. Henry took his equipment and he climbed to the peak of Pinnacle Hills near Field Street and South Clinton. Before we had Holy Sepulchre Cemetery for Catholic burials, here is the local Catholic cemetery. This is St. Patrick's Cemetery, high atop the Pinnacle Hill just east of Clinton Avenue South. And he captured photographs when there were still monuments up there, apparently. All of those, they at one point disinterred everybody that was at St. Patrick's Cemetery and moved them to up to Holy Sepulchre. Now, not only was there a cemetery up on the Pinnacle Hills, the cows got a great view. This is a view of a number of cows. They may be dairy cattle, I'm not sure. They are atop the Pinnacle Hills, and you are looking northeast toward the Erie Canal. In fact, that strip that you see in the background would be reduced in size to what you know today as Widewaters Pond up at Cobb's Hill. This is my neighborhood, and it is clearly marked as a scene in Palmer's Glen. Palmer's Glen was somewhere east of Winton Road North, somewhere between Monticello Drive and Dalkeith Road. Palmer's Glen was very popular as a walking destination. There are pictures of ladies in early 20th century white dresses, summer dresses, walking down a path in Palmer's Glen. There's a lot of publicity in the newspapers. It was a lovely place to walk near to the city before there were any county parks. And there was at one point a mill in Palmer's Glen, and this is, I can't imagine what it took him to haul his camera and equipment down into this ravine and set up and take a picture of the only thing left from the mill, this mill wheel, which is constructed of both wood and iron. This is a scene all of you have driven in your automobile. It's known as Float Bridge. For those who may be a little older in the audience, you may have heard that term from your parents and grandparents. This is Empire Boulevard. And he was standing at the top of Empire Boulevard, just east of where Winton Road ends at Empire Boulevard. This is the hill that you go down Empire Boulevard today to access Arundecoit Bay to the left, or the north, and the Arundecoit Bay wetlands to the south, which would be to the right. He took a number of fascinating views, and there's a tiny bridge to get you over the creek outlet. He took a number of views of Arundecoit Bay, showing not only the wetlands and the Arundecoit Creek, but also the very interesting geological features that surround the bay. The bay has an interesting history. It's the original mouth of the Genesee River. 10,000 years ago, the Genesee River did not go to where you know it today in Charlotte. It exited through Arundecoit Bay. But after the glaciers disappeared 10,000 years ago, the route of the river was switched to the west, and Arundecoit Bay, the river became Arundecoit Bay. Here's another view of Empire Boulevard looking down to the bridge over the creek, and again, no development, a very different landscape than we see when we drive on Empire Boulevard today. And this is probably a little farther north, in Arundecoit, just north of what would be Norton Street. There were many farms into the 20th century, and these hills were fabulous locations for grape vineyards. There was a lot of grape growing on the hills of Arundecoit overlooking the bay. We don't know where this scene is. This is another mystery caption that doesn't really identify at all what the scene is, though in the foreground there are acres and acres of cultivated flowers. We think they're tulips, so we're not sure if maybe he went out to the Harris Seed Company, which was west of Rochester, and they had a lot of display acres where they were growing different. This is not the Ellwanger and Berry Nurseries, so we're not quite sure where this was. We're also not quite sure of this scene. This is Monroe Avenue going into Pittsford. It's a bucolic dirt path. There's a horse and buggy, some fascinating houses on the right, but we have not yet been able to identify exactly where on Monroe this happens to be, but we know it's on the way to Pittsford. We know where these next slides have been taken, and when Pittsford historians saw them, they nearly fell off their chairs. This is the view of the biggest estate farm estate in the town of Pittsford, New York, owned by the Guernsey family, Guernsey. He has his camera positioned near the Erie Canal looking northwest at the huge barn complex and magnificent house that you have all driven past today, which is Mitchell Road, with that little one-lane bridge that goes over the canal. You are on the Guernsey estate. Close-up views he was able to get from some rather unusual perspectives. Here are those same barns, none of which survive today. And if you look carefully, in the bottom left corner, you'll see sort of a fleur-de-lis sticking up. That is the cast iron cresting on the cupola of the Guernsey home. He's up in the cupola of the Guernsey home shooting this photograph. Now, what did the Guernsey home look like? Oh, and that road in front, that's the farm path that came into the farm. It was not a public road. Today it's Mitchell Road. Here's the Guernsey house. Amazing to look at. And you can only see it in photographs because it was consumed by fire in the early 20th century. This is a shot that a number of Pittsford historians and longtime residents were dazzled when they saw this photograph because no other view of this house in this detail exists. Today, the house that replaced it after the fire, you may have driven past this large, white, columned colonial revival mansion that the next owner, Mr. Mitchell, who was a very wealthy businessman, he constructed it after the house burned down. Across the street where all of those magnificent agricultural buildings are, Mr. Mitchell was a dedicated and nationally ranked horseman. He raced horses on the flat. Here are the beautiful carriage barns on Mitchell Road that he built, and replacing the agricultural barns that you saw in that earlier view. These have been adapted into 2 housing units. One in this major, there's no other complex like this in Monroe County that shows early carriage barns of the 20th century. And there's a courtyard in the midst of this. Next door to this is one housing unit today. This is the south barn that has another housing unit, and you can see the bridge, the one-lane bridge over the canal on the left. Guess where this is? The Grand Canyon of the East. Henry Durgin did go farther afield, as far afield as Niagara Falls and Ithaca, but he also got down to Letchworth, was the Letchworth Estate. It was not a state park at that point. Mr. Letchworth was a very successful businessman whose hardware business was over in Buffalo. He was so successful he could retire when he was 40 years old. And what you all visit today, Letchworth State Park, which is 17 miles long, that was his private summer estate. He owned all of that, which eventually came to the state of New York for a state park. So we're not sure exactly when Mr. Durgin was photographing this. It's well before the state took ownership, but here are a number of views of not only this Genesee River Gorge in the Letchworth State Park, but also some of the fascinating historic buildings in the park. Here is a complex of buildings of which, difficult to see, are sort of in the Swiss chalet style. Some of these do survive in the park today. Here's another building that does not survive in Letchworth State Park. It was some sort of dormitory building. We're not quite sure its exact use. Of course, the very famous trestle bridge that sadly was removed several years ago for a new bridge. Here is the view that was selected as the cover photograph for the exhibit back in the 1990s. And then a view that I think shows that you can be a daring-do person, but sometimes common sense completely leaves you. This appears to be Henry in one of the most precarious sites I can imagine, posed out over the Genesee River Gorge in what looks like a not terribly healthy tree. But there he is in his suit, his tie, his hat, and it's either Henry or his brother. Apparently his brother they look very similar, but I don't know if this was a big joke that they were playing on each other, but it is certainly the most bizarre, certainly amusing, I guess you could say, photos in the Durgin collection. This is a photo that Henry took. He did go over to, how can you ignore one of the great wonders of the world? It's just 90 minutes to the west of us. Here is a really lovely photograph, one of several of Niagara Falls. I'm not sure if this is the American Falls or the Canadian Falls, but it's quite dramatic. And then we have 4 images that are truly need explanation. This is not upstate New York. He apparently went to Bermuda at some point. We don't know in what capacity. Was he selling furniture down there? Did he go for a vacation? I mean, he owned a company. He had some disposable income that he was able to buy camera equipment. Perhaps he traveled. We simply don't know. Fortunately, just last week, my colleague Christine Radarski knows a faculty member at the U of R who, as we speak, is doing an archaeological dig in Bermuda and has written extensively on Bermuda cultural and historical topics and events. And we're going to talk to him about these images because there are 4 images, and he's selected not buildings or people, but 2 types of trees. One is a royal palm, which you see here, and the other is a different type of palm tree that I'm not quite sure, but it's definitely not found in the northeastern United States. So I don't know if he had a particular interest in horticulture. These were of such a surprise to me when I saw the collection that while they were identified, we really have no explanation yet as to how this fits into the life of Henry Durgin. Now, the life of Henry Durgin, as I said, 2 of his brothers came here. Charles was here only a few years. He's listed in the city directories as a woodworker, but he would leave and go back out and rejoin the whaling industry and would live in California the rest of his life. Charles is highly important because he, like his brother who kept a journal as a POW, Charles kept a journal during a whaling voyage in 1864 to the Arctic, and that journal has been reprinted in a book called More Scrimshaw Art, written by Stuart Frank. Charles also has lasting renown as an exceptional scrimshaw artist, and a number of his pieces survive. Now, this is what I think of when someone says to me scrimshaw. Some sort of ivory tooth. It could be a whale tooth, it could be a narwhal's tooth, it could be a walrus tooth. This is the kind of scrimshaw most people are familiar with. Now, how does this all work into the photographs of Henry Durgin? This is the rest of the story as to why these photographs were lost and then found. As I said, Charles Durgin was an acclaimed scrimshaw artist because of what he left behind. He lived longer than his brother. I think Charles dies in 1917, where Henry dies in 1912. These are Charles' scrimshaw tools. I don't know how these survived, but they have. And my guess is upon his death in California, these were part of the artifacts in his family that survived. I found this online, this photograph, his tools for doing his scrimshaw art, which did not involve whale teeth. He did his scrimshaw art on abalone, an extremely hard surface and very, very rare in the scrimshaw world. This is a very unfortunate article to have discovered. It's from 2003. Thieves' Net, Rare Abalone Scrimshaw Collection, Unique Carvings Stolen from the Point Lobos Museum. What had happened apparently is upon Charles' death, whatever family artifacts existed went to his wife's niece. Now keep with me, this gets complicated. Her name was Bernice Mason. She was faced with finding homes and fortunately understood things were important. The scrimshaw collection was the most important thing she assumed she had inherited from her aunt and uncle. And she did find a repository in California that some of them went to, the majority of them went to, And then they displayed it at Point Lobos Museum, which is under the National Park Service in California. There were other things, though, in this collection of materials, a box that said Uncle Henry's photographs that Bernice got. She sent 8 pieces of the Scrimshaw collection and those photographs off to the Kendall Whaling Museum in Massachusetts, an institution that has now closed. They were thrilled to get those abalone Scrimshaw from Charles Durgin. And right now, that's the only surviving examples of his Scrimshaw art, because the majority of the collection was in California and it was stolen in 2003. It has not yet been recovered. Sadly, the Kendall Whaling Museum closed. We'll get to that in a minute. But at the Kendall Whaling Museum, they were thrilled to get the Scrimshaw, but they didn't know what to do with Uncle Henry's photographs, which, by the fact that they had captions, the curator at the Kendall could see most of the views were in New York State. So he had a buddy, Milo Stewart, the curator over at the Fenimore Museum in Cooperstown, and he called Milo and said, "Would you like these photographs?" And Milo accepted the donation, and that is why the Durgin photographs are in Cooperstown. I wish his buddy would have been here in Rochester, because we really would have liked to have had the Durgin photos come here. As I mentioned, the Kendall Whaling Museum closed, and the Scrimshaw, if you want to see it now, is at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, one of the great museums in North America. If you've never been to New Bedford, the entire historic downtown is a National Register district, and you can see here some of the spectacular exhibits they have at the Whaling Museum. As I mentioned, they got the Durgin Scrimshaw, and the photographs, at last, by the 1990s, came to the museum in Cooperstown, which was then called the New York State Historical Association, but they rebranded themselves, and their current name is the Fenimore Art Museum. So we come full circle to the 1990s phone call from Milo Stewart to Carl Kabalak at the University of Rochester, who then talked to me. We were thrilled. We saw this article that was published in the 1990s quarterly journal of the Fenimore Museum, but it wasn't until 2014 that I had a chance to drive to the Fenimore Museum with my digital camera, and all of the views you saw here were me standing on a chair over a table taking pictures directly down with my digital camera of a good of sampling of the Durgin photos. Since then, they have all been digitized by the curator, but they are not yet ready for being entered into a public website, which we hope will happen soon, because you will all want to see them, as will many other historians from these different communities. I leave you with one image that is not from Henry Durgin's collection. This image, which goes back to, you never know what's still out there to be discovered. Henry Durgin's photographs were off the radar screen for almost 100 years, and they have yet to debut on a public website, but they have survived. Charles Forbes, who lived about the same time period as Henry Durgin, produced many, many fascinating views of Rochester and other places where he was on faculty, Minneapolis, Elmira, and New York City. But he also went up to Mount Hope Cemetery with his family, where his family plot, the Jonesborough Forbes plot, is beyond anything else in the cemetery, the way the stones are laid out in concentric circles, and there's over 30 interments. Charles Forbes took his camera with him when they must have gone to see their family plot, which he photographed extensively. But they walked down the hill to this site, which is still there today. The road you see on the right is Hillside Avenue, which is now a hiking path. It's no longer a carriage road. This glass negative was just discovered in March, wrapped in 3 layers of 1903 newspapers in a wood box out in Chip Stevens' studio in Pulteneyville, the great-grandson of Charles Forbes. We opened this newspaper, and I put this glass plate negative on his light table, and then through digital magic, we made a positive of it. You are seeing Dr. Forbes' mother-in-law standing in mourning clothes on the right. Her daughter, Edith Chapman, who would become a noted actress, movies, stage. Edith is kneeling down planting 3 geraniums. She has a trowel and a watering can. She is planting 3 geraniums, one of the most mundane and common activities in any cemetery for decades, for which there are almost no known photographs of people planting flowers on grave sites in Mount Hope in earlier decades. So we were thrilled when we found this. There was nothing identifying it, but we knew immediately by who they were. The big surprise was whose grave this is, that we didn't find out till later. This is the grave of their neighbor from Cornhill, a man named John W. Humphrey. John W. Humphrey had a daughter named Maud Humphrey, and when she got married, one of her children's names was Humphrey Bogart. This is the grave of Humphrey Bogart's maternal grandfather. Most people don't realize that Humphrey Bogart had a connection not only to Rochester, but for many years as a child, he and his parents, his dad was a very wealthy surgeon in New York, and his mother was a very successful artist. Humphrey Bogart has great memories of coming up to Canandaigua Lake for the summer as a child. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but his mother, Maud Humphrey, was extremely famous as an artist. So here, when we figured out at last from some, I won't go into the details as how we figured out where this was. The other interesting item about this photograph is this headstone doesn't exist anymore. When John's wife died, his wealthy daughter, Maud Humphrey Bogart, apparently decided to put the current headstones on her mother and father's grave and a really large central stone in this plot that has the name Humphrey carved in the middle. So not only is this culturally interesting because it's showing people planting geraniums on a grave, but then you get into the details of who they are, whose grave this is, and that you're looking at a view that is absolutely not the way it is today. So when you're out there looking around in closets, a relative dies and you have to go in the attic, you go to a garage sale and you're poking around, please keep your eye out for this kind of documentation. We know it's out there, and as I've said, you just never know where you're going to find these. It's miraculous that Henry Durgin's photos survived, but we know there's even more out there. So I leave you with that piece of instruction, and thank you for coming this afternoon. Any questions? Yes?
Do we have any idea what type of camera or even both these images?
I knew you were going to ask that question because you're a member of the Photographic Historical Society. No, that's one of the missing pieces of information that we don't have. That 1912, when he died in 1912, the obituary is about this long, and it tells he's, was a member of the Masonic Lodge, and was a big deal in the Masons, and what he did for his employment. I think it's fascinating that his last employment was at Eastman Kodak Company, because again, he was a woodworker originally by trade. I have looked on FultonHistory.com newspaper website as well as the Democrat and Chronicle archives, and there's absolutely nothing out there that mentions his interest in photography other than that 1912 article with a simple sentence, and in earlier years, he was considered the most talented amateur photographer in Rochester. That one phrase in his 1912 obituary article is the only thing that cites his involvement with photography. So those of you who are photography experts can probably speculate all sorts of things. I'm assuming he wasn't using a Brownie camera, which was available in the late 1880s. And again, all of these images of Durgin's are not dated. It's that we have the print, no negatives. What else did he photograph out there? I know from talking to another colleague who brought in 133 glass lantern slides from a landscape architect's office that had survived 100 years. And I was so excited, and he didn't tell me for like 5 years. He said, well, Cynthia, the first time I saw all this stuff in a barn, there were like 500. glass lantern slides, but the other ones got misplaced. So I think of Henry Durgin. We've got 130 some images.
You said there were 5 by 7?
They're approximately that, yes. And then they're on that, I'm sure it's not called cardboard, but it's a dark brown or black stiff board that they're glued to. That's how remember it was a box that said Uncle Henry's photos, and that's what got passed from California to the Kendall Whaling Museum to Cooperstown. And there's no additional documentation other than Bernice Mason was the donor, and she was the niece of Henry's younger brother, Charles. So that's how that got passed around. Any other questions? Yes?
What is the institution in Minneapolis that you mentioned?
Oh, not an institution. Dr. Charles Forbes was hired when McAllister College just opened, and there were 5 faculty and 30 students. But he took pictures of the campus, the interior of his house. They're fabulous photographs of the infancy of what's a very fine school that survives today.
Is it St. Paul?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have said St. Paul. Any other questions?
I just have a small anecdote. My mother was born at 44 Madison Street, and she would always talk about as a child, the lady told me to call the police, and it was like baseball in the park. Across from her house.
All right. Now I will tell you who Old Lady Coleman was.
Go ahead.
You know the photograph you saw with the 2 adults and those 2 little girls? Old Lady Coleman was the little girl, the youngest daughter, Lillian, who lived from she died in 1957. She was born in the 1860s. Cornell University class of 1896. Member of the American University of Women, very active in women's organizations. She never married like her widowed mother, because Mr. Coleman dies in the 1880s. Lillian Coleman was Old Lady Coleman, and her business she bought and rented. She repaired houses and she rented real estate. And she was a not very nice woman. She raised her nephew's adopted daughter. This gets very complicated. Who told me, because I knew this woman for years, and Old Lady Coleman would make her little adopted niece or great-grandniece go out and collect rent from the tenants in the 1930s and 40s. Miss Lillian Coleman did not go out and collect the rent from her tenants. So that's who you're talking about. You're not talking about Jane Taylor Coleman. She dies in 1917. You're talking about her daughter, pardon?
Yeah, it would have been her daughter.
Her daughter, Lillian.
Born in 1936.
As we would say in the vernacular, Lillian was a real piece of work. She was very well educated. She was a savvy businesswoman. There's a very interesting article in the Democrat and Chronicle that she bought the house next door to Mary Anthony's house, and there was a new program in the 1920s that the Democrat and Chronicle was sponsoring, renovating old houses for new residents. And she had them take her house as the demonstration house, and there are photos of before and after floor plans. It's an amazing document, but it shows some of her business acumen. But as somebody raising a child, that was not her cup of tea. Now, does your parents survive?
No, my mother's passed away, but my grandfather bought 44 Madison Street in 1922.
Which is 44? Is it
It was Lucy Lipa's house where her dad was arrested for being the comptroller for the Rochester Mafia.
It's not the brick house.
It's the brick greenhouse with the round window. That was my grandfather.
Okay, I know which one you're talking
And
about.
then in 1943, they bought 18 Madison Street. They were going to rent 44 off. This was split as a duplex, but because of redlining, my grandmother couldn't get a mortgage for that street, even though she was on the mortgage.
Interesting.
So they were supposed to sell it to Joe Lipa for cash.
Oh,
Those who had money to put the mafia in during World War II to buy houses.
so is Pat Lipa your cousin?
No, they're not related. Joe Lipa, so Lucy Lipa inherited the house of her father. She was a special needs instructor for the city of Rochester. And we lived at 18, and then my grandfather had his optician's office in the parlor at 44, and then at
Very interesting.
My grandfather is self-taught English immigrant and had a college degree by 1922.
I know another person whose grandparents had immigrated from Italy, and they settled on Madison Street. And he's had some very interesting information over the years, but that's interesting to hear about, quote, Old Lady Coleman.
Old Lady Coleman. She always called the police. And there was still today, there's a sign in the park that says no ball playing. She had that erected.
That sounds par for the course. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
You said that Lake Avenue was called Charlotte Boulevard?
Once you got, remember, the city of Rochester was originally just 4 neighborhoods, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and 4th wards. And the city boundaries have changed over decades. During the 19th and into the early 20th century, the city itself could legally take in land that was previously in Arundecoit, Greece, Gates, Brighton. People look at their deeds today and they go, what's this about Brighton? I'm in the city of Rochester. Well, the land was originally in one of those towns. So I believe when you got to Ridge Road, which remember, Ridge Road, you couldn't get across the river on Ridge Road until 1931. There was no Veterans Bridge that had been constructed yet. It stopped at Lake Avenue. I believe starting at Lake Avenue or Ridge Road or a little bit north, it was called Charlotte Boulevard because you were headed to the village of Charlotte, which was not annexed into the city till the early 20th century. And then at one point, the entire street was renamed Lake Avenue. Yes?
Was it at one point called Harbor Boulevard?
I'm not familiar with
I
that.
thought I saw that on a map.
It's possible. That's why it's sometimes looking at older maps can be very confusing. Now, Karen, you do a lot of research on cycling, and there was a cycling track up what is today Lake Road. Have you ever seen the name Harbor Boulevard?
I've never seen the name.
No.
Charlotte Boulevard either. I'm not familiar with that.
So I don't know about Harbor Boulevard. That almost sounds like a 20th century name that you would give a street. But we did have the harbor on the west side of the river. There was the port of Charlotte was an official port. There was a port collector. There was a customs office. The buildings.
I saw it on a map,
Yeah.
maybe around 1900 map.
I have to plead ignorance. I would need to have
I'm just curious.
our colleagues in the local history division over in the Rundle building would be a good resource to talk to. Any other questions, comments? Thank you again for coming, and keep an eye out on your website so that when we get the Durgin photos up, you'll be able to see all of his images. And if you find any information about him in your wanderings and research, please let the Fenimore Art Museum know, because I gave you as much information as any of us have at this point. There's a lot of missing pieces.